finish yesterday. Chairman, thank you. Mr. White, good morning. Yesterday I was trying to ascertain from you if the operation of the 16th was planned according to Standing Order 262 and it was written. What did you say was missing, which are critical public order policing measures that ought to have been reflected if the plan was written?
Chair, excuse me. I don't know that there are specific measures that were necessarily missing, but a plan, I think, is something that has measures, and then it also has an order to it. So I haven't looked at this plan and said they forgot to include this particular element. I looked at the plan in the sense of what they were trying to achieve and how they were trying to achieve it, and I raised concerns in relation to those aspects. So it's not to say that I would point to a particular issue that was missing. Excuse me. But it's a combination of things like, for example, we were talking yesterday about the rollout of the wire and how Mr. Scott interpreted how that should happen and what its purpose was compared to other people, how they interpreted and what its purpose was. In my direct evidence, we had talked about the original configuration of the wire and what that seemed to be intended to do. I think the word that Mr. Scott used was canalise, and we had a discussion about the meaning of that word. But if you looked at the original configuration of that wire, it suggested that people couldn't come towards the informal settlement. But yet within the outworkings of the plan, it would seem that there was provision to allow people to come towards the informal settlement in between the time that the wire was rolled out and Mr. Callitz was he would give the warning and then he would wait for a while. So my point basically in relation to the plan was that there were a number of issues which I think were confusing and to some extent contradictory. But in answer to Mr. Semenya's question, is there a particular thing that, a magic pill, if you like, that was missing within that plan? Not necessarily so. It's about understanding what it is that you're trying to achieve and having a plan which will help you to achieve that. And I'm not so sure that in this particular plan those two things are in place.
And yesterday we agreed, I thought, that your criticism is really aimed at saying you cannot risk-free disarm, as you call them, 3,000 people on the copy. That's the focus of your criticism.
I think that's a statement of fact. Well, in my opinion, I suppose, that no, and I've said this in I think all of my statements, no approach to this would have been risk-free. This was an inherently complex, difficult and dangerous operation. So, yeah, it goes without saying, I think, that there's no approach to this which is risk-free. My criticism, I suppose, is that there are variations in terms of the levels of risk, and the way that this was approached, I think, increased the level of risk considerably, specifically with regard to the potential for the use of lethal force.
And Mr. Semenya asked you about disarming 3,000 people. If you reduce it to 300 to 400 on the basis that the evidence indicates that it may be correct to say that there was a militant group of about 300 to 400 and the others were not as militant or not militant at all necessarily, if it was to be seen as a plan to disarm the 300 to 400, would your comments still stand?
If you could even hypothetically imagine, Chairman, that we were dealing just with 300 to 400 people, the group that's been described, and they were sitting on the copy in isolation, just on their own. No one else was there. I still think that this is a very difficult, complex, and potentially dangerous operation where you're sending police officers who, by necessity, would be heavily armed in to deal with that group. And therefore, you have to ask yourself the question, what is it we're trying to achieve and why are we trying to achieve it? And then you're balancing up the risk. However, that's not the circumstances that the South African Police Service faced on the day, because in addition to what we've just described, there were all of these other people. So there's the potential even for collateral damage in relation to people who potentially are not going to be aggressive, because of course the disadvantage that the South African police have in trying to delineate who's who is that, unlike the police service, they don't wear uniforms. So it's very difficult to, in a crowd like that, to be able to absolutely identify who the more concerning group are. And I suppose that, going back to Mr. Semenya's slightly earlier question, with regards to what was missing, well, one of the things that would have been missing in the plan, if you like, was any mechanism for filtering with regards to allowing people to come off the copy. Those people who wanted to simply walk away, those people who perhaps were never intended to engage with, in any sort of confrontation, if indeed there were people who were. As I said before, that the plan was slightly confusing because it seemed to try and do a number of different things. But if the police service were happy to allow people to leave the copy, but had to differentiate between those people who were armed and those people who weren't, one of the things you would have expected to see is some sort of filtering mechanism for people leaving the copy, and that wasn't present.
Mr. White, I have time constraints. If there is a way in which you can answer my questions without embellishment, I would appreciate it. But if you have to, then that's what it is. If you were in the JOCOM meeting of 16 August 2012 at 13:30 and the provincial commissioner said, I want you to go and disarm those people in the copy, do I understand you to say you would have said, no, it can't be done?
I'm absolutely satisfied that, given my experience of dealing with these issues, I would have raised an objection. I spent 30 years in a disciplined organisation, and I understand the concept of orders, but I would have raised an objection. And from my very first statement, but my provisional statement, I highlighted the fact that I was surprised that no one did so.
Yeah, but what would be the objection if the conversation in the JOCOM is, we are going to put up a barbed wire, and let's disabuse our minds of what we know now. We're going to put a barrier, i.e. a measure that was not present on the 13th, to make sure that we delineate the group of strikers from the police. We expect, after we announce that we wanted them to disperse, that the majority of those who are in the copy will do so, as has happened as a matter of fact. And would expect that those who are belligerent and refuse to disarm would be a minority in the 300 or 400. We will use standard operating procedures of POP to use water cannon to split them into smaller groups. We'll use the armored vehicles to split them into smaller groups. We'll encircle smaller groups and arrest those. Where we fail to do so, there would be other tactically trained individuals to do it. How would you meet that argument in the JOCOM?
I meet the argument by basically saying, first of all, this issue of what is it we're trying to achieve? And we have a responsibility to try and achieve that, i.e. the disarming of people with the minimum use of force. That's our responsibility. And my first point then would have been, all through the planning process, Lieutenant Colonel Scott had talked about an encirclement option early in the morning when there weren't many people around. So why don't we do that? The second thing I would have been suggesting would have been, as people approached the copy later on in the morning after we had done the encirclement, to have some sort of filtering mechanism that if people wanted to come and protest peacefully, then that's entirely their right to do so. But there would have been a mechanism to ensure that people who were armed were deterred from coming, or alternatively that the arms were able to be taken from them. So that's the first thing.
Let's test the first thing, as you point out. On your analysis, there was insufficient intelligence to tell us where these people are, where they are sleeping, and we knew from Lonmin records that only 10% of the workforce was staying in hostels. Correct?
I think I can agree with.
And what we also know is that according to the reconnaissance that was done by Brigadier Khaled, there were only a few people in the evening at Copy 1.
That's correct.
So we would have planned to encircle Copy 1.
That was Mr. Scott's plan.
Yes. And to our horror, Mr. X tells us they were at Copy 3 all the time, hiding there. How would that have achieved the goals that we sought to achieve?
Sorry, Chair, obviously that's a disputed fact. I'm assuming Mr. Semenya would like Mr. White to assume that people were hiding in Copy 3.
Well, yeah, it's not even a disputed fact. It's a non-existent fact. Mr. X never said such a thing.
Well, let's not get involved in that. I think the simple point is Mr. Semenya asks or I take it implicitly, Mr. White to accept it as a fact for the moment and proceed to deal with it.
As an assumption?
Yes, I say to assume it's correct. Whether it is a fact, whether there's any evidence to deal with it, whether if Mr. X said it, he can be believed on that, all these other matters we don't have to debate at the moment.
Okay. Chair, then, if it's helpful, the planning that we are engaging with was in relation to the issue at Copy 1. The police certainly, whether that's a disputed fact or not, but what wouldn't be disputed is that the police weren't aware of that at the time. So the police are engaging in relation to Copy 1. So therefore, my understanding of the evidence is that the vast majority of people left Copy 1 at some point during the previous evenings, leaving a small number, and I think that it's maybe a disputed fact with regards to how many, but a small number of people on the copy of an evening. So therefore, there was the potential to carry through Mr. Scott's plan and to encircle the copy, which I think had the intention of being able to engage with that much smaller number of people who are on the copy, but also to prevent people coming back to the copy the following day, as I understood it.
And to use your expert opinion, sometimes a particular police conduct can escalate the response of the crowd.
Yes, I've said that.
So if we mistakenly went to Copy 1, it may have agitated those who were in Copy 3 on the assumed facts that are intended to take into account, correct?
I think so, but I think you had to have the caveat in terms of not using the benefit of hindsight in relation to those police officers. And at that stage, whether it's a disputed fact, if I'm assuming that there were people in Copy 3 for the purpose of this argument, but at the time, the police didn't know that.
Yeah, but if we were having this conversation at 1330 Jocom on that day, and I'm saying, if we arrest a few and don't arrest them all, we are going to have another problem now of 3,000 people demanding the release of those that were arrested. Would that have been one of the factors we must consider?
I'm genuinely not sure that I follow your argument, because if your argument seems to be suggesting that if you arrest some people, well, then you're going to have a bigger problem because you're going to have 3,000 people protesting against those arrests. Well, if we step back and we and I haven't raised an objection at the JOCM about the plan that Scott wants to go with, which is around arresting people. Well, surely you would have ended up with the same position anyway, that if you arrest people, you potentially have 3,000 other people who are protesting. So I don't really understand.
You don't understand. You don't understand.
You're saying to me that the actions of police often result in a reaction. I've made that point. Okay? What you've just asked me is that if I raised the objection, if I had been at the JOCM and I raised the objection against Scott's plan and suggested, no, let's encircle the copy early morning and make arrests of the fewer people on it, given the assumed fact that maybe there were other people at copy 3, not 3,000, but you mentioned the word 3,000, so therefore my assumption is what Mr. Semenya is saying to me is that by following through this encirclement plan, we enrage, if you like, the 3,000 who are now going to protest against the arrests of a smaller number of people.
I'm just asking whether that would have been a possibility.
Well, potentially it's a possibility, but my point is that surely that's exactly the same outcome. Then, logically, if you follow through Scott's plan as actually was enactioned on the 16th to arrest a number of people, if potentially there's going to be a protest against those arrests, well then there's going to be a protest against arrests. It doesn't matter when the arrests happen. So I think that those two facts cancel each other out in terms of a consideration.
All right, and then you postulate, make a filtering line. And I give it to you that when you wrote your provisional statement, you hadn't been to Marikana.
That's correct.
Having been there now, you saw it's a rugged rural terrain. And given the fact that the people who were coming to the copy were coming from all directions, exactly where would you have put the filtering line?
Given the fact that people come from all directions, but there were certainly, if you like, concentrated points. For example, the small road that comes from the informal settlement up alongside of the corral, lots and lots of people approached that way and subsequently actually left that way. So there are strategic points that you could look at where you could put a mechanism in. Because what we're trying to achieve in terms of putting in a filtering line, ideally, if you can prevent anybody going there with weapons, then that's ultimately what you would want to achieve. But in putting a filtering mechanism in, what you're trying to do is make the situation much less worse. So you maybe don't perhaps catch every single person, but you can make the situation potentially less worse. And the fact that there's a filtering mechanism in there might actually deter people who want to come with weapons from actually approaching in the first instance. So it's not a perfect solution. I don't for one second suggest that. But there are a range of measures, including that potentially help the situation.
And if I was in the JOCM meeting, I would have said, Mr. White, on Monday, Mr. Mpembe had a line of police and asked them to disarm. And what they did is they just permeated that line. How would a filtering line this time work?
Well, I think we're talking about two very different set of circumstances. What happened on Monday was that Mr. Mpembe and a small number of police officers, we saw that in the video, were addressing a considerable number of people. I engaged with the facts around the 13th, the last time that I gave evidence. And the very fact that there was no substantial planning for that, and we talked about that issue as to why, on a time factor, they couldn't have sat down and worked out a comprehensive written plan. But also, the evidence suggests that there was no substantial briefing. Lots of police officers who were there didn't know what it was that they were trying to do. So basically, the crowd...
Mr. Nichol, I'm afraid you're disturbing us with your conversation. I'm sure you didn't do it on purpose, but if you want to have a conversation, I suggest you have it outside. We find it distracting.
So basically what happened was Mr. Mpembe gave them the ultimatum when he started the count, and then the crowd got up and walked away. Given that there hadn't been any significant briefing, the number of police officers who were there compared to the number of people, I mean, realistically, the police would have been in a difficult position to be able to stop them. Having said that, there is evidence that Mr. Mpembe's instructions were actually, despite the fact that he gave them this ultimatum, that he was going to escort them. So actually, it's a very different set of circumstances that, you know, the police were allowing them effectively to walk away, and the police walked along with them. And then it would seem that the evidence is that obviously the confrontation happened at a later stage, sparked perhaps by the issue of the stun grenades and the tear gas. So it's a very different set of circumstances.
No, Mr. White, with respect, I'm not talking even the time when General Mpembe had changed his mind that they be escorted instead. His main purpose, he came in, they were in the center, they were surrounded by police. He said, put your arms down. I think maybe that's how a filtering would work. They just stood up and walked. What would have changed it with the filtering that you contemplate should have been a preferred process on the 16th?
I don't think that Mr. Mpembe, having a number of police officers with him who had no plan, who hadn't had any substantial briefing, would represent the type of filtering line that I would be talking about, where if at that JOC meeting at 13:30 hours on the 16th, we potentially had have said, look, this is not a good idea to do what Mr. Scott's suggesting at 3:30. There are alternatives. And maybe to wait until the next morning to do the encirclement plan, which he had suggested for pretty much most of the week, supplemented by what I'm suggesting, for example, some filtering lines. What that would have looked like would have been very, very different from a number of police officers who, with all due respect, seemed to be almost acting on their own initiative on the 13th because they hadn't been properly briefed. I conceded before in my evidence that there wasn't time to sit down and write a written plan. I mean, some of the correspondence that went between my legal team and the SABC legal team seemed to be suggesting that I thought they should stay in wherever they were for a few hours and write up this plan. I mean, I never said such a thing. In fact, when I read Mr. Mpembe's statement before I completed my provisional statement, it implied that there had been a plan. It implied that there had been a full command structure in place before that operation on the 13th. It was I who actually pointed out that I suspected that it was a spontaneous response. And it was, and it needed to be. The point is that those officers still needed to be properly briefed, and lots of the evidence points to the fact that they weren't. So, in terms of Mr. Semenya's point that this was a filtering line on the 13th, and I'm suggesting a filtering line might have been of help on the morning of the 17th, for example, we're talking about two very different things, Chair.
If you put your filtering line on the west, people could have simply come from the east, given the terrain. No, or am I wrong?
Well, I fully understand the terrain. We're talking about a wide, expansive area. But if you think even about the plan as how it rolled out, you know, some of those police resources which were in the west, I think Mr. Kidd's team were in the west, you know, they were actually effectively supposed to be having a filtering line working in the opposite direction. In other words, you know, the plan was that they were to protect the informal settlement, and as people approached them who were being dispersed from the copy, they were to act as a filtering line to make sure that no people with arms went into the informal copy. So, to an extent, we'd be talking about something similar happening the other way around.
Kidd's evidence is they effectively did act as a filtering line because the people who approached them, they told them to lay down their arms, and they did. So they did perform that function, in fact, as far as I remember the evidence.
That's correct, Chair, and that's the point that I'm making. You know, what actually transpired on the afternoon of the 16th was that Mr. Kidd's teams, who had been, as part of the plan, were supposed to be in front of the informal settlement to the west to protect it. The idea was that as people moved away from the copy, if they were armed, they were going to effectively create this filtering line. In other words, so that armed people weren't allowed access into the copy. Well, I'm basically saying that if that was part of his plan and he felt that, you know, that would have been sufficient, well, maybe on the next morning I'm suggesting that simply worked the other way around. So instead of people being filtered this way. They were being filtered this way.
Move your hands, indicating firstly your hand moving from the left to the left of your body to the center, to the middle, and the other one is the other hand from the right of your body to the center.
Apologies, Chair.
It seems to me, Mr. White, you agree with how the police had planned, that if you get smaller groups isolated and circled, it would be easy to disarm them, as the chairman illustrates the evidence points to.
Well, I think it's fair to say that it would be easier to disarm a smaller group than it would be a larger group. I do have some issues, I would have to say again, with the plan with regards to, as Mr. Semenya himself points out, we're talking about a wide open space, and the fact that how the plan was supposed to roll out was that the police resources, with the POP officers being at the front of the dispersal group, were to come out from behind the wire and then start moving towards the crowd. I'm expecting at that point the crowd, particularly those that don't want to be disarmed, will run away. How effective the POP coming forward, being able to catch up with those groups and surround them as part of the plan, I don't know. And it may well be a point that I need to concede in so much as actually that's not how I would normally have done that sort of thing. Maybe it is slightly different given the fact that we're talking about wide open terrain as opposed to most of my experience comes from an urban environment, and I'm perhaps happy to concede that, but I just really didn't understand how that was likely to work, that literally with the police coming so far behind people that they were going to be able to actually catch up, surround them. But I will bow to the better judgment of people who have maybe been in that position before.
Telling a POP member to do a channeling would not require a written down instruction. They would know what that means, right?
Apologies. Could you just say that again, please, Mr. Semenya?
Telling a POP trained police officer, we're going to channel the crowd, they would know what that entails. You don't have to put it in writing, am I right?
I'm sure that's correct.
And telling people that we are going to disperse, telling POP people you are dispersing, you don't have to write that down. It's the standard operating procedure, right?
From the evidence that I've read, I think that it's a phrase that's often used here, and I'm sure that POP officers probably understand that, yes?
And that they should effect an arrest, that's also a standard operating procedure, right?
I'm sure they know how to arrest people, yes.
So those would not require a written plan given to each commander, apart from identifying what are positive and negative attraction points. Is that fair to say?
My criticism in relation to the plan, sorry, I don't think, perhaps that's not what you want me to answer.
No, I want you to answer the question I'm putting to you as opposed to giving me a total spectrum of things that you think I may be going to, Mr. White, really. I'm saying, and if I'm wrong, say I'm wrong. I'm saying if you say to POP trained people, we are going to channel this crowd, all you need to demonstrate, to tell them is this direction or that direction, and they would know what to do. No?
In answer to your previous questions, I replied, yeah, I agreed with you in relation to all of them. I'm sure you don't need to write down for police officers who are experienced what it means to disperse, what it means to arrest, what it means to, I forget the other term that you used. But just for absolute clarity, that's not the criticism I make in relation to no plan.
Well, I thought the plan was go disperse, disarm, and arrest them.
If you look at my supplementary statement, I go into some considerable detail about this, about the fact that we're talking about a complex operation, a dangerous operation which involves a lot of different resources. The numbers of officers involved and also the number of different units. And the point is that a plan needs to show who's going where. You need to understand as the TRT what your role is.
No, but Mr. White, with respect, I'm focusing now on what the POP element was supposed to do according to the plan. I can talk about what TRT would do, what NIU would do, what STF would do according to that plan. And each one of them, you don't tell STF how to take out somebody if there's a sniper in the STF, for instance. Am I right?
I wouldn't disagree with you, and I haven't made that criticism.
We have been given the, what do they call this document now? The Special Rapporteur report by the Human Rights Commission. You're familiar with the report. I don't have to all have us copies. I will read the
I don't
relevant.
know that I'm familiar with it.
Chair, for the record, is my learned friend referring to the report we gave you yesterday, which is the UN Special Rapporteur, the report of the Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial summary or arbitrary executions from April 2014? Is that the report?
That's a report, Chair.
Seen it, does it have to go into some exhibits? If it's being referred to, I take it has to be an exhibit.
Chair, we have repeatedly asked the SAPs if there are any new documents they intend to put to Mr. White. This is the first time we're hearing they intend to put this to him, which he has not had an opportunity to see.
You said you gave it to me yesterday.
Because I intend to use it for Mr. De Rover.
So, well, never mind. It's going to go in anyway, so let's give it an exhibit number.
Yes, but Chair, the point is Mr. White has not had an opportunity to look at this report.
Oh. I would suspect that, being the expert he is, he will be familiar with a good deal of the material contained in it. And I'm sure if it's anything like the special rapporteurs reports we've seen before, it's very, very largely fairly trite material. So I would, if he has a problem, he'll let us know. But I wouldn't expect him to have one, frankly. So,
Chair, can I also then
exhibit?
just repeat my request to the police that if they intend to produce any new documents to Mr. White, we are given notice of them.
I'm sure that point's been noted. I take it to be fair. The police think that seeing you produce the document is likely that your side will know about it. I understand there may be a false assumption then because there may be a false assumption because the legal representatives may have a document, your witness hasn't seen it. But anyway, let's proceed.
Chair, it's quadruple B8.
Quadruple B
8.
A special rapporteur report. Special rapporteur report. What's dated what? How do we describe it?
1 April 2014.
1/4/2014. I think that's all we need to say to describe it. That's quadruple B8. And if the witness is at a disadvantage, he's got a copy of it, I see, on a laptop. And if he finds himself unable to deal with something because he hasn't had a chance to study the document, I'm sure he'll let us know.
Let me lead this by saying that Mr. Hendricks opines that public order policing has various segments to it, one of which is what he calls prevention. You take a multitude of stakeholders and try to anticipate difficult moments. You accord yourself with that?
Yes, I do.
Now I want to read paragraph 63, which would appear on page 11 of that report.
Chair, does my learned friend have it available for display to the auditorium?
Chair, can I just read this? If my
The question is, can you put it up on the screen? The
I
answer
can't, and that's what she
obviously
knows.
no. Answer's obviously no. Let's carry on without it being put on the screen.
I'll try to read it slowly, but at least you have it before you.
The idea is for the benefit of those of us who are up here
Correct.
At the table and the people in the chamber. But we will listen carefully as you read it, and I'm sure we won't be at a disadvantage.
Thank you, Chair. Under the heading Prevention / Precaution, paragraph 63 reads, "To this should be added the hyphen, often overlooked hyphen requirement of prevention or precaution. Once a situation arises where the use of force is considered, it is often too late to rescue the situation. Instead, in order to save lives, all possible measures should be taken in quotes upstream to avoid situations where the decision on whether to pull the trigger arises, or to ensure that all the possible steps have been taken to ensure that if that happens, the damage is contained as much as is possible." You would accord yourself with that quotation.
Yes, I would.
So, again, I want to rest on the strength of your opinion as an expert. South Africa must move away from the often seen scenario where in protest action, they either arrive with the tires burning there, or they arrive with cars having been torched, or they arrive after the buses have been torched. We ought to move as a society to where we can resolve these problems before they get to the calling of police. Would you, can I rest my argument like that on the strength of your accord?
I'm sure everyone would want to see that, yeah.
And really, as the report points out, often when the use of force is to be deployed, it's almost too late.
Yeah, it does make that comment, yes.
And it would be useful if the Commission was to recommend, for instance, the following: that in industrial disputes, you don't, as your first port of call police and the Minister of Police, etc., instead of containing that discord through industrial and labor relations instruments. Right?
Well, I think that we had this discussion before, and I mean, I'm therefore on the record saying that, you know, as a professional police officer, I look to everyone to exercise their responsibility with regards to avoiding, you know, violent situations.
Can I quickly go through your statement, Exhibit J 178, and just confirm, if we may do this a little quicker, starting at page 50, you deal with section 5.2, which is planning and briefing. And I think we've gone past this one, that the type of briefing that requires POP to do a dispersal would not be one that takes long, for instance, if you have identified what the positive attraction points are, negative attraction points are, and what you seek to preclude happening.
Two really important points from me, Chair. One is that I'd said earlier on, I don't think you need in a plan a written definition of dispersal or arrest. That's the point I was making. But the plan needs to tell people what it is that they need to do, where they need to go, how. That's the issue.
Obviously, I want to explore that. I just want to exclude that does not need to be told to people for now.
The definition of how to arrest someone or how to disperse them, no.
It's something that can be done quickly.
Yes.
And telling the TRT this is your sweeping role, at a particular point you'll be 100 meters, at another point after the POP dispersal you'll be closer to effect the arrests. That can't take long either, can it?
Dealing with one particular unit to do one particular task, then I'm sure it could be done quite quickly.
Okay. And you accept this is what they were told, who will be at forward holding area 1, at what point they would come to the operation?
Well, this is part of my criticism because I don't know who was told what, in so much as there's a lot of contradictory evidence about how people understood the briefing. I just need clarity.
That confusion doesn't arise among the commanders, even on your analysis of the evidence. General Naidu knew exactly what his role was in relation to that operation and what he must do when what happens. So did Captain Kidd. There was no confusion around that, am I right?
Well, with respect, Mr. Kidd makes a number of statements, and in those statements he actually gives a slightly different interpretation of what his role was in I think the three statements he makes himself. But I thought that you'd referred me to this statement to look at the 13th. This relates to the...
No, that's all right. I know you...
Deal with the 13th. You've now moved on the 16th. Do you want to refer him to a passage in his statement dealing with the 16th, or are we going to stay here?
Well, about the 13th, we are in agreement that you don't criticize the fact that they attended to a spontaneous, dynamic, and mobile people. That you don't criticize?
Not at all.
Okay. And you don't criticize, as I see in paragraph 5.26 on page 52 of your statement, that General Pembe did not have a written plan.
Because of the dynamic nature of the circumstances, I don't think that it was reasonable to ask him to sit and write out a plan. No.
Yes. But you do say at the top of page 53 that if they had planned sufficiently to ensure that the tactical configuration of resources placed the police at a considerable advantage, when would this sufficient planning have occurred, you'd suggest?
Well, Mr. Semenyo, I think that you're taking bits of my statement and extrapolating a point. What I've said throughout my engagement with the 13th, if you look, Chair, when I talk about planning, I use the word plan or brief. And then the issue that Mr. Semenyo is referring to there is, what I'm saying is that if the police intention had been, we are going to disarm this group, then actually dealing with a group of in and around 200 people who were heavily armed would have required some considered thought and plan, because that's an inherently dangerous operation. I say in my statement, if, however, given the dynamic nature of the situation, and it was a pragmatic approach, which I think is ultimately what effectively happened on the day, Mr. Mpembe, and I've actually in my statement congratulated Mr. Mpembe for his approach to this, tried to negotiate with them, and then said, look, to be pragmatic about this, we're going to escort them. Then I said, a detailed plan wasn't necessary, but still, people needed to be briefed with regards to what was expected of them. Now, there is lots of evidence which suggests that there was confusion from the officers who were involved in that escort as to what it was that they were expected to do. Some people were aware that Mpembe didn't perhaps want them to go into the informal settlement. Other people weren't aware of that. Some people talked about that they were supposed to disarm from the outset. Other people talked about them escorting. The point is that clearly officers weren't properly briefed. And my point of criticism, therefore, is even though it's a dynamic situation, even though they're under pressure, because you're going into this dangerous and difficult thing, people need to understand what it is that the commander wants and how the commander wants them to do it. That's not about a written plan which is going to take 30 pages and 3 days to write down. That's about the commander being sure himself what it is that he wants to achieve and properly explaining that so that the officers who are involved in the escort fully understand it. That's my point.
Shall we now look at paragraph 5.213 on page 55. Before we deal with it, though, I think we have agreed the last time we had this conversation that police doctrine is based on past experience, what works, what doesn't work. We've gone past that point, right?
Of course.
And by the 13th, even with General Mpembe, there was no history where firing of tear gas or stun grenade would provoke an assault on the police or hacking of police.
Well, with respect, I genuinely don't know that. If you're asking me to assume that fact is true, but I don't know the history of policing in South Africa and can't say with certainty that this has never happened before.
Yes, and then you say, though, that they must, that's the last sentence of that paragraph. You say, if the stun grenade was fired without authority or the tear gas was fired without command, then it appears that their unauthorized action directly contributed to the confrontation. Now, two things about it. You do accept, as you correctly concede, that you don't know what the historical knowledge and experience of South African police is in relation to the use of tear smoke or stun grenade. That's the one thing, right? The second thing is, if it can be accepted as standard that the use of tear gas or stun grenade would launch an attack on the police, doesn't that radically reduce the non-lethal force available to POP?
I don't think that, I'm confused. Are you what I'm saying is that when police use tear gas or stun grenades, that's likely to provoke an attack. I'm not saying that as a general point. I'm saying that having engaged with the evidence in relation to the 13th, it would seem that this group are being escorted in accordance with Mr. Mpembe's instructions, in accordance with agreements that he reached with them. I think the transcript of the conversation is QQ2, if my memory serves me correct. So they are being escorted. And then it would appear on the evidence that I've engaged with from the South African police that stun grenades and potentially tear gas is fired by individual officers without an express instruction or order to do so, although there does seem to be some dispute as to whether or not there was an order by some officers. However, in terms of then looking at the implications of that for the fracas that breaks out that results in a number of people being killed, including 2 police officers, it's not just me. I mean, Mr. Marafe.
May I interrupt you, Mr. White? And I don't intend to do so. I'm really asking a simple question that if we get to a point where the use of tear gas and the use of stun grenade provokes an attack on the police, that must seriously attenuate the non-lethal options available to them. What can be complicated with that statement?
Chairperson, I'm sorry, I'd like to understand whether this question is intended to cover all situations under the sun or the specific situation that pertained on the 13th. Because Mr. Semenya seems to be suggesting that the use of tear gas per se in any situation would provoke an attack.
He is. I don't understand that to be objection. That's how I understand the question. I'd like to hear what the witness's answer is to it. What Mr. Semenya is saying to you is that if it's correct, he asks you to make the assumption, I take, that the tear gas and the stun grenades in this particular case provoked a violent response from the strikers. And he's saying to you, effectively, what do you say about the proposition that would appear to flow from that? That if that's so, then the use of stun grenades and tear gas will effectively mean that there will be lethal consequences in any event. So that PRP have got limited resources to use as it is. If you're going to take stun grenades and tear gas away because they're likely to provoke the kind of response we got, then they've got even less to handle, to deal with. Is that your question, Mr. Semenya? And he'd like your answer on that.
Well, I would imagine that tear gas and stun grenades are normally used in a situation of violent confrontation with crowds. So, my point, and a point that I've made consistently through this, is that one of the considerations that police, in dealing with crowds, have to consider is that their actions are likely to provoke a reaction from the crowd. And that's not to say that, as a result of which, police officers shouldn't take any actions which appear to be offensive. On occasions, and I said yesterday, in answer to Mr. Semenya's questions, when he pushed me on a particular point, it may be necessary for police officers to fire live rounds in a public order situation if the imminent threat is so high. That's likely to create a response from the crowd. Does that mean to say that we, then have to remove firearms? The issue that we're dealing with here is that this crowd appeared to be being escorted, and we're proceeding back to the copy and agreement with Mr. Mpimbi. An officer, it would seem, fires tear gas or stun grenades in advance of any fracas breaking out, and that fracas then perhaps came as a result of the use of inappropriate force. And it's not just myself that says that. I mean, police officers, including Mr. Marafi, has said something to that effect in his oral evidence. So, the consequence potentially, now maybe the crowd would have attacked the police anyway. Maybe they were intending to gather up another 100 yards along the line and attack the police. I don't know that. We can't possibly know that. But the point is that on this particular day, it would seem that having been being escorted and not at that point being involved in attacking the police, then the police used force and there was a response to that. Does that mean that from now on that you need to take stun grenades and tear gas away from the South African police in case it provokes that sort of reaction? No, I don't think so. I think what that means is that we should look at every set of circumstances in which it's used to understand how it's used, if it's being used properly, and to address those incidents where it's not.
In fact, Mr. White, if an officer fired a tear gas or a stun grenade without any command, at worst that exposes him to disciplinary action. It does not say the consequence of that is that there would be an attack on the police line. Fair to say?
I think as an absolute statement, yeah, that is fair to say. The consequence will not always be there an attack on the police line.
Well, up to that point, there has never been a history of any attack on the police purely because a stun grenade has been fired. And you said you can't contest those facts, you don't know them.
If you're making that statement, Mr. Semenya, I'm not in a position to argue with you.
Correct.
And, Chair, of course, there is not evidence before the Commission that in the history of South Africa, use of tear gas and stun grenade has never provoked an attack. We're assuming that fact. And that must just be clear as well.
Well, that was the
It's not an
evidence.
objection, Mr. Leroy. I suggest you keep out of the debate. Carry on, Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Chair. You make the observation at page 56 of your statement, Exhibit J 178, at paragraph 6, I think the thrust of your observation that is that with allegations that General Mpembe's life was threatened.
Sorry, Mr. Mpembe, or Mr. Semenya, could I interrupt you? You said at paragraph 6.
C.
C.
C on page 5-6.
Paragraph 5.3.1c at the foot of page 56.
Sorry, I thought he had said 6. Apologies. I
also got lost, but
I follow you now.
I found the page more quickly than you did.
Were you aware that there were attempts at identifying who would have uttered the threats, and Colonel Vermaak said he can identify those?
Yes, I became aware of that subsequently.
Oh, subsequent, okay.
Which I think I refer to in my supplementary statement, which is made some considerable time later.
Okay. And at page 58, I think the thrust of what you say is that given what you write about before, you would have expected disciplinary actions to have followed particular events. Is that right?
Yes.
And you're not critical of the decision, or maybe you are, of the decision by top hierarchy to say, given that the commission has been announced and given the fact that it will do its work within 4 months, we will commence with all of these things after the commission's work. You don't take issue with that if it's the evidence.
I understand that as an approach. My comment in relation to the page 58 that you're talking about was that given the fact that 2 police officers, in addition to 3 other members of the public, had been killed in an operation, I would have expected to see an immediate response to that. So the commission wasn't introduced and set up until obviously the events of the 16th. My comment therefore is, in order to learn lessons, in order to try and establish what exactly has happened and to ensure it doesn't happen again perhaps, I would have expected to see if the allegations are right with regards to the initial action of police officers happening without specific instruction to do so, i.e. the firing of the tear gas and the stun grenades. If that is what caused this fracas to happen in the first instance, I would have expected to see a debrief and an investigation start after the 13th to understand what happened. This is before anyone would have realised what was going to happen on the 16th.
The law in this country tells us that a police officer can disobey an instruction that is patently unlawful. You accept that?
That would be the same in my country.
Yes. And I want to suggest to you that a decision by General Mbombo that 9 deaths later, that armed protesters on the copy must be disarmed, is not one such instruction that is patently and manifestly unlawful. Do you agree with me?
I absolutely agree with you.
So what you're critical about is the how that disarmament was to occur.
Absolutely correct.
If we go to page 59 of your statement, still J 178, and we look at section 6.2 where you deal with inadequate intelligence. I take it, Mr. White, you accept that No. Are you familiar with the evidence that the people in the copy were told not to have any cell phones?
I'm aware of seeing evidence to that effect.
And allegedly, at least, Mr. Twala was killed for carrying one on the copy that had airtime on it.
I've seen that evidence.
And this group of people were trying as best to contain the information within the network. Even when they speak, they were speaking in crowd formation, a smaller circle by themselves. So that was their modus operandi. You saw that on some of the video footages.
Okay, I'll accept that. Yeah.
And if Mr. X is to be believed, they even chose copy 3 as a rendezvous because of its tactical advantages it would give them from detection. Given that...
No, Chairperson, this is coming up again. There's no such evidence.
He put on the basis that if he's to be believed.
No, Chairperson.
It was in his statement.
Even if he's believed or disbelieved, he didn't say it. The evidence that Mr. Smear is referring to was referring to copy 1. You can go to Mr. X's statement. It never said that they went to copy 3 for all these purposes. It's not there, believed or unbelieved. It's just fiction.
It is there. I'll show it to Mr.
My
Mpofu
recollection, it was
in the
written
statement.
Well, then he must show us.
It was in the written, my recollection was in the written statement. Let's see.
It's in the supplementary statement.
Well, yes, the supplementary. Yes, it is. It's one of the things that was not in the first statement, it's in the supplementary statement. That's correct. But it is there. Whether it's to be believed or
No,
not,
it's
let's
not there
see
in the
whether
form
your-
that it is being
Let's
put.
see whether your recollection is better than mine, Mr.
Yes,
Semenya.
thank
Mr.
you.
Semenya, can you show us the passage you're referring to?
Chair, can I obviate this? Clearly, if what I am putting as a proposition to you is incorrect, the answer is immaterial. Mr. White, can we go on that basis?
That's a sensible way forward, Mr. Semenya's got limited time. I think we just let him use it as economically as he can.
Do you accept that environment would have compromised intelligence gathering capabilities for the police?
Yes, I would, and we talked about this at length when I last gave evidence. I understand there were difficulties in gathering intelligence.
And where on page 60 of your statement you talk about you'd have expected the intelligence to have information about in relation to the intention of the protesters, how long they intended to maintain their protest, details on individual key members of the group, where the majority of the people who left the copy each evening went to. Such type of detail you would have ordinarily expected, but you accept it was compromised in relation to this operation.
I understand that gathering evidence was difficult in this operation. However, as we talked at length and the last time I gave evidence, my criticism still stands with regards to TT5, which is the composite of all of the intelligence available to the police for this operation. There are 10 entries on that document, a number of which relate back to February and May, a number of which refer to the organisation of the JOC. There are only 2 or 3 pieces of actionable intelligence, and therefore I then went on to give examples of where there were other intelligence opportunities available which didn't seem to be grasped. So my point is that I fully understand that intelligence gathering for this operation may have been difficult and hampered by exactly the sort of circumstances that Mr. Semenya refers to. However, I would absolutely still stand by my criticism with regards to the lack of intelligence and also even the limited intelligence it was, how the police acted in response to that in relation to this operation.
And if I understand your evidence, you do not disapprove for the use of multiple units in this operation if everybody knows what their role is and given the dangerous circumstances that presented themselves.
I've specifically stated that actually it was welcome to see that they were involving different types of units with different types of capabilities, given the complexity of the operation.
So I'm correct.
Yes.
In that regard, to differ with Mr. Hendricks.
That may be so. This is only my opinion.
That's right. And just to tidy up with you, on paragraph 66, page 66, paragraph 6.4.3, we have agreed that concepts like disperse, encircle, disarm would be standard operating procedures for a unit like POP.
Yes, I understand. Yes.
Now, page 70 of your statement. Paragraph 6.4.8. In the middle of that paragraph, you say what you say and you say. I say that primarily because there was no urgent need to implement an offensive tactical option on the afternoon of 16 August. That's what you say there.
Yes.
Can I explore that with you?
Mr. Semenya, could I make one point in relation to this particular part of my statement? Remember, at the point that I'm writing this, what is referred to as my final statement, I'm engaging with a set of circumstances which turned out not to be accurate, in that I'm following through Mr. Scott's lengthy statement, I think it's H20, forgive me if I'm wrong, about how the planning process goes. But what I subsequently found out and refer to in my supplementary statement is that, of course, that the approach to stage 3 wasn't in fact informed by all of the things that I had been engaging with, but actually it had been a decision taken by General Mapumbo, discussed with the National Management Forum on the 15th, and the decision had been made then. So to some extent, some of the things that I say in relation to my final statement might be something that I need to revise, simply because I was engaging with a set of facts which perhaps were not strictly accurate.
And Chair, to assist the Commission, in Mr. White's supplementary statement, that's section 2.2 commencing at page 3, where he deals with the decision to move to the DDA operation.
And I haven't even asked the question. That's what you have written in the paragraph, haven't you, Mr. White?
Yes, that's what I wrote in the paragraph at the time.
Now let me explore that with you. You can tell us what would have been the consequence had the police done nothing on the 17th, the 18th, the 19th, and the 20th, or going forward, can you?
I can't, but I've never suggested that they would do nothing.
Well, there is some opinion that suggests maybe you do nothing because there is no escalation, there's no point in doing anything. You can observe it throughout. You don't share that opinion, do you?
I certainly wouldn't share the opinion that the police do nothing.
By way of disarming the group?
Again, I wouldn't share the opinion that police do nothing.
Okay. Now, and by the time the operation was launched on the 16th of August, the position, obtuse or otherwise, that was taken by Lonmin that they were not going to go to the copy was not going to change. You can accept that premise, correct?
I've seen evidence to that fact. I don't know what would have happened in the future, but yeah.
So the primary demand on the copy was not going to be met insofar as they wanted Lonmin to go to the copy.
Well, I don't know what Lonmin's intention would be and whether it would have changed, but if you want me to assume...
On the evidence that you have read, on the evidence that you have looked at, on the evidence that you have analyzed, there's nothing to indicate that position was going to change on the part of Lonmin. Is that fair to say?
Okay, I'll accept that.
And on the evidence that you have seen, Mr. Matunjwa had made his plea and drove off in exasperation that they're not listening to him.
Well, yeah, I'm aware that he drove off, yes.
And if some of the evidence is to be accepted, the group was intent on going to attack the police.
I think there's evidence to that fact, and there's also evidence to the contrary that I've seen.
So the police evidence is then that there was nothing anymore to wait for but to disarm the group. You say that still leaves you standing to question how that was to happen.
Yes, it does lead me to question how it's going to happen.
But of course, you know, even beyond copy 3, there were many vehicles of Lonmin that were touched by some of these individuals. You are aware of that evidence?
Yes.
So that risk was still present to assets of Lonmin, even despite the intervention.
Could just ask for clarity, Mr. Semenya, vehicles that you're referring to being torched by Lonmins, when specifically, just so that I have it in my head, when are we talking about that happened?
On the 12th and the 16th, just on.
Well, as I understand the evidence, it was the 12th and the 16th.
Yeah, but specifically on the 16th, would I be right in saying that that happened subsequent to the police operation?
Correct. On the same day.
But subsequent to
Yes.
the police?
Approximately an hour after 36 people were killed. 34. We say approximately an hour after 17 of the 34 had been killed.
Well,
dealt with in slide 259 on Exhibit L. It simply stated it was after the police intervention at the Koppies.
yes.
I'm not sure if it was between the... Mr. Shaskelson suggested it was after the people were killed at scene one. I think it was after they were killed.
There are entries in the occurrence book, and one picks up the call in the radios on the radio as well. It's
what time? Yeah, thanks. I thought it'd take a second. Right. Okay, it'll take time to find it. Let us allow Mr. Semenya to continue. I think the essential point he's making is after some of the shooting had taken place, or all of it, one of the two, a number of vehicles of Lonmin were torched by strikers.
Sir, where does that come from now, Chairperson?
It's from the slide. There's evidence, I think, and there's a slide in Exhibit L that I referred to.
The slide tells you who touched the vehicles.
Well, it's an inference that one can draw.
Well, let's not make assumptions about people that we can't prove, Chairperson. We don't know who touched the vehicles after the shooting. The strikers...
Well, no, we know. We can draw inferences, but there's no direct evidence, you're correct. Anyway,
thank you.
I think you carry
on. Page 71, Mr. White. Paragraph 6.4.10, sub A. Just so that I can know there is no confusion between you and I. You do make the distinction between the decision to have the people disarmed and the how that disarmament must happen.
And when?
And when, the how and the when. Well, I'm not too sure about the when, because the instruction was that if they did not disarm on that day, then they would have to be disarmed on that day.
But that's my point. I would question the how and the when.
Yes, if it was operationally sound to do it on that day, it would have had to happen.
If it was operationally sound to do it on that day, then yes, it should happen on that day. I suppose my point all along has been maybe it wasn't operationally sound to do it on that day, and perhaps it could have waited.
Page 72. At the top of that page, you have a little Roman figure 3, where you say the JOCO meeting took only 30 minutes from the beginning to end, which was hardly enough time. How much more time did you think was required?
Well, Mr. Chairman, the JOCO minutes that we have from a variety of meetings show a sort of set procedure where they talk about things like intelligence update, they have a roll call, etc., etc., the sort of types of things that you expect to see in any meeting. The significant thing about this meeting is that Colonel Scott, who's the chief planner, when he comes to this meeting, he's told, we'll now move to stage 3. But at that stage, in Mr. Scott's own evidence, there was no stage 3 as transpired in terms of how he was going to do this plan.
Again, Mr. White, what would you have considered to be sufficient time? And given whatever else you have in mind about it,
I don't know what sufficient time would be, but I'm surprised that a meeting which lasted 30 minutes, including all of the issues that I already talked about, and the fact that Lieutenant Colonel Scott has not only to present a plan, but is effectively to make it up as he goes along. His evidence is that that is what happened. He basically described to other people how this would happen. Now, I've raised issues with regards to, I was surprised that no one seemed to raise any objections, no one seemed to challenge how he was going to do this, not least this issue with regards to 60 TRT officers being lined up behind the POPs. So the short answer to the question is, I don't know how much time it is, but I do think that the fact that that meeting took place 30 minutes for the entire meeting, and this was a meeting not during which Scott explained the plan as such, but he effectively had to make it up as he went along. It seems to be evidence, if you like, of a very cursory sort of look at how they were going to engage with the situation, which was, as I've said all along, inherently complex and dangerous.
What you've now said isn't entirely correct. My understanding of Colonel Scott's evidence is that he already had an idea of how it could be done. It was a sort of embryonic idea and concept, but he did have a basic idea. He had been tasked at the early meeting that morning to prepare well, the evidence is that from Mr. Brigadier Carlitz is that it was, and it's in the minutes, it was agreed that an alternative plan would be drawn up in case the weapons weren't handed over voluntarily. Brigadier Carlitz says Colonel Scott was the person who should have done that. Colonel Scott concedes he didn't do anything of it. Well, he says he can't remember what he did during the day, during the morning, if that evidence can be believed. And he says that he did have an idea of a concept in his mind. And he says that when no one else, when it was announced the tactical option is now going to be implemented, nobody else put up a hand, suggested how it should be done, and he then put up his hand and suggested how he thought it should be done based on the concept that he'd already had in his mind. So he wasn't exactly making it up as he went along. The truth is, as I think I've summarized it. Your point, of course, is that for a meeting that's 30 minutes in total, he obviously didn't have the full 30 minutes to brief on the plan. We don't know exactly how long it took. Your view, as I understand it, is that that was inadequate. But I don't know one has to add the making up the plan as he went along, because I don't think that's factually correct.
Well, I apologise, Chair, and I'll respectfully withdraw that remark. But I do, I'm absolutely familiar with all of the evidence that you have referred to, and Mr. Scott may have given some thought to, an outline concept as to how he's going to do this. But actually, what he then was starting to explain to people, if the evidence then is accurate with regards to showing on the Google Earth map where the different deployments would be, I would suggest that, I don't want to be unfair to him, and I don't mean this in a derogatory sense, that he was making it up as he went along, but in fact that if he had this broad concept in mind when he started to get into the detail of how this would operate, he must have actually been making this up as he went along. And as I say, I don't mean that in a derogatory sense to him. But the point that I'm making is that other people who were at that meeting are therefore hearing this for the first time. And we're talking about an operation which will ultimately involve hundreds of police officers from all different types of units to go and engage a large crowd in complex and difficult circumstances. So, how long should that meeting have taken? I don't know how long sufficient is. My point is that I think that for the whole meeting to have lasted 30 minutes, it suggests that there was a very cursory engagement with what this outline plan would be, because, of course, there wasn't any written plan at that point.
Page 73. Paragraph 6.5.2 at the bottom of the page. You talk about it being unclear whether the plan on that day was to encircle or to disperse and disarm and arrest. Am I correct?
That's correct.
But you do accept, having looked at the video footage, that the configuration of the lineup of the Nyalas, barbed wire Nyalas, which was stage 2, would not have been consistent with encircling the copy.
I accept that.
Okay. Following page 6.5.3, in the middle of that paragraph, you say, where arrests need to be made, it is often better to make those arrests after the event, having recorded evidence of criminality by video during the event itself. Now, the police tell us that the problem was not only that the people were having arms and you can therefore later arrest them for possession of arms, but it was people who were being killed and dying. So the agency was to stamp out possible further killings that would be occasioned by these arms. You think that was a bad call for them to make?
No, Chairperson, the evidence is the exact opposite of that.
Prof, don't interrupt. Let the witness answer. I'm sure
No,
the
but Chairperson,
witness doesn't need your help.
Chairperson, how many times have you said to me, I cannot put hypothesis where there's no evidence? Why doesn't that only apply to me? The evidence is the exact opposite, that they were prepared to do stage 6 at a later stage. I'm saying that you can find it in the evidence. We can't, if he wants to go to his hypothesis, what, he can do that. But you can't say the evidence is the opposite of what the evidence is.
I didn't understand the thrust of the question to be that. The thrust of the question was, whether it was correct or not is another matter. The thrust of the question was, killings were going on, the police had to arrest sooner rather than later to stop further killings. That's my understanding of the question.
No.
I think Mr. Semenya must be allowed to continue. I've so ruled.
No, Chairperson, with respect.
Semenya, sorry, Mr. Mpofu, I've so ruled. Let Mr. Semenya continue.
Chairperson, with respect, I'm saying...
If you want to show me respect, abide by my ruling. Mr. Semenya, please proceed.
No, Chairperson, I have to make this point. I hear what you're saying. I'm just saying you're making a mistake. Mr. Semenya said the evidence is. Those are the words. I can't leave it like that just because you didn't hear those words. He says the evidence is, and I'm putting to you that the evidence is something completely different. That's the proposition.
Well, you've made your point. May I suggest it's now 10:30. We take the first comfort break. Mr. Semenya will take on board what you've said, and we will proceed.
Thank you.